World War II was over, but the two victorious powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, broke their alliance and became enemies, dividing the world into two blocks, the Western capitalist bloc, led by the United States, and the Eastern communist bloc, led by the Soviet Union, starting the Cold War. This gave way to the Korean War, which was also divided. Latin America lives in most cases on unstable ground. Regions of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia began to decolonize. Some European countries began to recover from the war, and entities such as Japan and Germany began to develop like few other countries. Modernity had come. This brought optimism to society. Industrialization and the economy began to grow. Cities became bigger and bigger. People left the countryside. The United States claims its place as a power and begins its model of consumerism. The way its society changes influences a large part of the planet. And young people, of which there were many, question the world inherited by their parents. And with all of this, the foundations of the 50s are built. The 1940s had been ruled by the big band and swing, but at the beginning of the new decade, they were losing dominance to a new form of pop, the great voices.
Hey there, baby, make up your mind.
Inspired by Italian melodies, a new archetype of stars was created. Mitch Miller of Columbia Records set the tone for the development of popular music until the middle of the decade. Miller integrated country, western, rhythm and blues, and folk music into the musical mainstream, causing many of his label's top artists to record them in a style that corresponded to pop traditions. New ways of approaching arrangements and albums changed the rules of the game. Instead of capturing the sound of live bands, they were making 3-minute musicals, heavily influenced by Hollywood cinema as well. Before there was an attempt with records to emulate the sound of live bands, now the records would lead the way of the industry. They led Frankie Lane, Guy Mitchell, Rosemary Clooney, Patti Page, Tony Bennett, Ella Fitzgerald, Johnny Mathis, Dean Martin, Eddie Fisher, Billie Holiday, Nat King Cole, Brenda Lee, and of course, Sinatra. The musicality was changed. This new pop focused on the story of the songs or the emotion expressed in each lyric, and Sinatra took these new movements to build himself as the first great star of music. He was the first great musical phenomenon, and the foundations of fanaticism were born with him. In an era where producers could have singers almost as manufacturers, Sinatra broke with several industrial icons and gave him much of his identity. But not everything was pop. The southern United States was immersed in other currents, and the working class adopted country music, with simple form, folk lyrics, and harmonies accompanied by instruments such as banjos, fiddles, harmonicas, and many types of guitar. African American, Mexican, Irish, and Hawaiian music had a formative influence on the genre. The radio had its references, such as Woody Guthrie and Hank Williams, and future stars such as Bo Diddley, Buddy Holly, Jerry Lee Lewis, Richie Valens, Johnny Cash, Roy Orbison, and Carl Perkins emerged as the new representatives of the style. The Nashville sound turned country music into a multi-million-dollar industry, an industry that satisfied the demands of one part of American society. But there was another side that stood in stark contrast to this music. African American communities had their own sounds. Rhythm and blues was their standard. The great migration of Black Americans to the urban industrial centers of Chicago, Detroit, New York, Los Angeles, and elsewhere in the 1920s and 30s created a new market for jazz, blues, and related musical styles. Fats Domino or Little Richard were among the many exponents of another industry that became rich. And although at first only African Americans bought R&B records because they were only sold in their markets, gradually young whites came to the genre. I got a gal that I love, so I'm ready. The sound was changing, and Little Richard or Carl Perkins were taking the sound to new territories. Suddenly, in a country like the United States that still encouraged segregation, a phenomenon occurred that mixed the music of the whites with the music of the blacks. And in that combination, rock and roll was born. In 1951, Cleveland, Ohio disc jockey Alan Freed began playing rhythm and blues music to a multiracial audience, and is credited with the first use of the phrase rock and roll to describe the music he was playing. In the early 1950s, a young man named Chuck Berry was working with local bands and St. Louis clubs as an additional source of income. He had been playing the blues since his teens and borrowed guitar riffs and theatrical techniques from blues musician T-Bone Walker. Berry's showmanship, coupled with a mix of country tunes and R&B melodies, sung in the style of Nat King Cole and with a little of the style of Muddy Waters, appealed to a wider audience, particularly affluent whites. He was called the father of rock and roll because he understood that the roots of rock could be found in blues and country, and instinctively combined the two. And with these foundations came someone who brought rock and roll broadly into the mainstream of popular culture. It was Elvis who made rock and roll the international language of pop, brought it into the culture, into society, into the youth, accompanied by figures like James Dean, forged the image of rebellion. Elvis changed the course of music. His recordings, dance moves, attitude, and clothing came to be seen as the foundations of rock and roll. He opened the spectrum also to rockabilly and ballads. Elvis was the world's first superstar. Pushed by TV, by radio, by magazines, by movies, he was the first star to commercialize his image and open more doors to the music business. Racists attacked rock and roll for the mix of black and white people it implied. Elvis Presley's popularity was similarly based in his transgressive position with respect to racial and sexual boundaries, considered by groups as a danger to American culture.
Dream, dream, dream when I want you.
At the same time as Elvis, there were other figures that filled other spaces in the development of the genre. Ritchie Valens, with only 16 years of age, opened the doors to Mexican-American culture. Buddy Holly broke aesthetic and sonic barriers for rock. He inspired the generation to come. In other places, the music was strongly influenced by the American culture. In Europe, they established jazz, swing, and traditional pop through the records and movies that arrived. And they began to produce their own rock and roll, and achieved, in exceptional cases, some world hits like Volare from 1958. Mexican-American culture influenced Latin America. La Bamba was the first Spanish-language song to reach the top of the Billboard charts. Daniel Flores, who some call the godfather of Latin rock, released his hit song, Tequila. The bolero was born in Cuba, and the bossa nova in Brazil. Tito Puente, an American-born Puerto Rican, revolutionized Latin music at the time. He incorporated many new percussion and woodwind instruments into the popular Latin sound. Jazz lived its moments of glory at the end of the decade. Some of the best albums in the history of the genre were conceived in that period, and the East Coast of the United States experienced one of its most important musical scenes. Miles Davis stripped jazz of its blues roots and pushed it towards a sound that had much more in common with European classical music. Critics gave this music the name cool jazz. The term cool started being applied to this music around 1953, when Capitol Records released the album Classics in Jazz, Cool and Quiet. The decade was coming to an end. Television was increasingly present in homes, and it seemed that better times were coming after all. But in 1958, and submerged in scandals by the conservative sector of the country, the king of rock, Elvis, paused in his career to serve his country, leaving a huge void in the world's youth. And on February 3rd, 1959, Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper, along with the pilot Roger Peterson, died in a plane crash near the small rural town of Clear Lake, Iowa. It shocked the world and was dubbed the day the music died. Without these idols and with Elvis far away, music seemed to be paused, in mourning, where the youth would wait for new reference.